Good evening. You're listening to the Xtreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob, broadcasting to you from the Pine Hills Palace, just west of Orlando, Florida. I am in the Xtreme Studios consulting on a case with a young 20-something Professor Pixel. And, of course, that case is the continuing evolution of our detective TV show review, Forever Night, Season 1, Episode 14, Spin Doctor. And I want to give a special shout-out to a couple of our listeners here on the Xtreme Movie Show, where I like to say we're an 80s-based channel because I was a teenager in the 80s, and one of our gentlemen on there is from the 90s, RDV, and the other one is, you're from the 2000s because you're so young. You're such a baby. But Pixel, I'd like to acknowledge on some comments here over the holiday weekend as we're recording this offline for a future release. Kevin Dobson, very passionate individual listening to it, talking about Shanky's name and all this and that, as well as fan with the broad grass, getting upset with our name pronunciations. Look, guys, appreciate y'all listening to it and sharing it with it, as we say usually at the end of some of these streams, that anytime you get a chance to review something that you like and enjoy, we pride ourselves as a channel not to necessarily just kind of like research every last little detail. We certainly watch the episodes, talk about themes that we make. And if you go back to listen to some of our other television shows, and of course the context of it, Pixel and I will have a different relationship than RDV and everything else. So I want to say thank you to Kevin and to Phantom for listening and giving some feedback about the channel, because you're right. One of the frustrating things about Forever Night being an early 90s show, which is something I clearly remember was live for at the time, Pixel, you weren't even a twinkle in mommy and daddy's eye yet, is the fact that it's frustrating to watch because you can find on YouTube in America, I'm based out of Florida, you can find for free the at least season 1 by a particular gentleman and all that, and they're okay episodes. I just went and bought the DVD, and I don't know which edition I have because there's Pixels. We've talked about this before, the first few episodes, trying to set things up. We talked about the main head vampire that turned, where we get the backstories, right? And I say, let's just call him LaCroix because that's what it sounds like and everything. But some people are like, it's LaCroix. Okay, that would be the pronunciation versus English, right? Well, same thing with Shanky or Stanky or Skanky, because I don't really like the sound of two of those names because I think it sounds very, how do we say it? Not appropriate or whatever. You got a detective and you want to call him Skanky like a whore, or Stanky like a shithead. So I think at the time too, going, well, he seems like he's one of those Polish kind of guys that we've mentioned, or somebody that likes to eat. That's an old TV trope there for detectives. We said, we're going to call him this instead of that. And so if you guys listen back to it, we definitely like to give some things out there. So I appreciate your attention to detail for it. It's not because we're shitting on the show. We like it and we enjoy it. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. Sometimes some episodes better than others, and we're not going to like everything equally. And that's the beauty of the Xtreme Movie Shows, that we just give our opinions and we do it cold, where we don't know what the other is going to be saying. So that's the fun part about it too, especially when we're live. But this episode here, Spin Doctor, I'm not talking about the music band Professor Pixel. I'm talking about what does a Spin Doctor do. They take things up. They take a situation. In the old days, that might have been called a closer, a fixer, a you don't really exist sort of thing. You might be like a closer fixer a la Brad Pitt and George Clooney and Wolves, which of course is not spelled right on Apple TV Plus, one of their movies that just came out. But it's about covering things up, or as we like to say in the 21st century, whatever we're in now, changing the narrative. And Pixel, let me ask you this. We're going in here, we're about halfway through the season, getting around that corner, finishing it off here. I think it's been pretty interesting so far. We said it almost seems like a police procedure in a lot of episodes. Some of them seem more vampires, supernatural based. This one is, to me, a rando kind of episode having to do with the mayor running for election. Something happens after our recent Columbo review, talking about the old guy getting electrocuted in the bathtub. I couldn't help but think of that when I see the opening of this, because we've got basically a pretty much straightforward detective thing here too. And for some reason, I was getting the vibe watching this that this seemed to feel like one of the earlier episodes, maybe because of some of the way things were going at it. What's your initial take on this?
Yeah, no, I have to agree. This one's a little hard to get into. And it's not because I think any of the actors just aren't doing a good job. I just think that maybe the subject matter is just not as impactful as it wishes that it was. I do like the flashbacks a lot of this episode, though.
And this one, okay.
Yeah. Because our main subject is a news reporter gets fried. Deep fried. Or toasted.
Yep.
Soaking in the tub, Somebody throws in, what do they throw in? A toaster? TV set. Oh, he has a TV set on the end of his bathtub. Oh my God. I was cringing at that because honestly, I can't imagine doing that. I was like, do you want it accidentally to fall in? It's not like the guy had to put a lot of work into his plan. It was literally right there. But no, this news journalist basically gets killed, and the candidates running for mayor are the main suspects. All the while, we get flashbacks to Nick as he's being grilled for being a communist.
Not only was he a vampire, he was a communist vampire. +1 for forever.
Evil!
Yeah, evil in its purest form. Absolutely, right? And that was the thing, too, when they do the flashback. I mean, obviously, they set it in such a time that was emulating what might have been going on during, say, around World War II-ish and all that, with the anti-communism thing in Hollywood going on, too, that a lot of people don't like. You don't really hear much about those things today necessarily, but how it was a big deal. And how basically after World War II, we took a lot of people over from overseas that were communists. Particularly, I always go back to the theme of scientists and government agents, because they know the things that maybe we didn't, and we wanted to basically keep them on the payroll. So some people think that's the way they infiltrate a lot of the upper level colleges and sciences here in the United States too, and exist to this day. And of course, if you go down that rabbit hole, you see where they made movies in the 60s, 70s, 80s about government control and just the deep state and all that too, whether you believe in all that political kind of stuff here. Is it relevant to this episode? It's interesting they pointed out, because one thing I did notice too, that I was going, okay, maybe this is going to be more of a vampire episode, because we definitely get a bit more vampire thingies going on here, whereas one time on a recent episode a few weeks back, we just basically seen vampire out during a shooting, right? This one here, what I thought was kind of interesting, and it's very obvious from the very beginning, that you're dealing with what you would call strong woman types, which is nothing wrong with that at all. And I think that the fact that this is a Canadian TV show and it's written for a Canadian audience is that you typically think Canada today, especially with Trudeau being in charge and the whole lineage, they're being very progressive, the capital and all that. And of course, being entertainment, that typically tends to land that way, even though the majority of Canada isn't necessarily, especially the East and West aren't very alike at all. So to see something like this talked about openly about, well, what can a mayor that's a woman do that a guy can't, and all that, it's definitely there in the writing. I'm not saying it's pertinent to what happens in the episode, because we've seen some interesting women on the show, very beautiful women, as a matter of fact, too. But this is one of those ones where I think the show does really, really good when you have the buddy cops doing their thing a little bit. We'll talk more about that next week's episode, because I just watched that too. But nobody cares about the mayor. Nobody cares about the race. Nobody cares about going undercover as a volunteer.
Except for Skanky and Natalie. They can. And honestly, I think that's one of the weak things. Oh no, I stand with this one. She's going to do it. Oh, please. And it's back and forth. And honestly, I feel like Nick in the middle of it. Like, I really don't care.
One thing that has been missing is that I always say I try to have the timer on for when we're going to see him first appear, either because he usually starts off clean shaven, then gets scruffy, then it stays that way. So I figured he probably shaves the beginning of the week and then not later in the week. But I also talked about when he's contemplating stuff and it's raining outside and he's laying on the ground, or like a prisoner bouncing stuff or throwing things and all that. Here he's kind of like, sitting at his piano in his dress shirt and all that too, but he doesn't have the turtleneck going on. So, we need a little bit more of the fashionista forever night here out of Nick to make it a really compelling episode, as well as, of course, a visit to the Raven, which, again, we'll mention in next week's episode, because that one is a lot different than this one here. But yeah, I'm trying to find something redeeming about this to say, other than it's quite clear that what's going on here is going to be the old switcheroo towards the end. We get a lot of women kind of talking, having things, they're looking through it all. And believe it or not, even when Stanky goes undercover and Natalie's there too, you get the feeling that, yeah, there's a race going on. They're trying to just do the best thing they can to have a clean race and all that, which nobody buys that in the real world. But I was waiting for the wah, wah, wah at the end, because it was interesting to me at the beginning to see the whole setup of the of the TV being put and the dropped in the tub. And you can argue about special effects and all that all you want. It's enough that sends the story, but the fact is it's not like Psycho where you got a girl in there and we don't know who does it till later and all that. We have a good-looking guy getting zapped in there later, so you're like, what's going on? Because this show does really, I think, shine when you've got, away from the buddy cop aspect of it, strong women in it. Here, what I thought was interesting at the end, as we get towards the big reveal, something happens there too that makes a woman, I think, somewhat interesting. Wish they would have done this earlier in the episode. But before we get to the closing part to it, I want you to fill in some of these gaps.
I mean, with the, because I mean, for this one, like I said, I'm trying my best to think of it some way to go ahead and dig into the scenes, but when we have their arguments, I mean, we could talk about Natalie for a little bit there. She tries to hide certain truths to keep her candidate from getting bad press for a minute, but eventually it comes out that the woman running for mayor did have relations with deceased. And this is what actually brings us to our closing bit, because her campaign manager has been egging her on, cheering her on, doing anything for her to win. And this is going to sink it. Her entire campaign is going to be sunk from here. And the manager recognizes that. How can you do this to us? You're supposed to be doing better. And that'll lead us to gunpoint.
Yeah. It brought up some other Forever Night stuff that we've talked about a few episodes back. We talked about a really great scene, a courtroom scene, and I don't remember the episode off the top of my head, but what was remarkable was the fact that Nick had to go in during the day and he was on trial, and we saw him kind of dressed up and all that too. And then we saw like the light in the room as he's out there talking. We saw the light kind of moving over towards where he's standing and being questioned, so he would lean back and stuff. And I go, okay, that was a really cool courtroom thing here. The interesting thing here is that the female murderer, she goes on the speech about it. I think Lisa's her name, right? The mayor candidate. And she starts giving a speech about it and comes kind of clean. I'm like, this would have been interesting if she alluded to having an affair earlier on, but maybe said she wasn't the killer, because then it's on them to kind of prove what's going on, because that's the real damage control and spin that would happen in the real world. Another thing too that was bugging me a little bit about some of it here that I don't know how intentional is as I said earlier, talking about how we pronounce names. There may be names that are pronounced a certain way, perhaps maybe on the Canadian broadcast, maybe not on the American one. But I swore that when I watched this, when I think of politics, I think about the red, white, and blue. But you know something, Pixel, that's America. Here, it's like, wait a minute, they're in Canada. So it's not the same. And so I don't know if that was a slip. I don't know if the writer was American. I really don't know to that level of detail. And you and I typically don't look that up. But it's just, that was a little, like, caught me off guard a little bit. It made it seem like the B-level plot with Stanky and Natalie being involved in volunteering to find out some information going the back way about it, while potentially interesting, was pretty much useless. I thought it would have been interesting if the pressure was put on there from the beginning to do it. And the whole communism backfilling, the only interesting thing about that to me is the fact that it was filmed in black and white. They did some of those angled zooms, the not the crash zooms where you zoom in, but where it's really, really close, as we like to say. And so I thought that was kind of neat. You definitely know when it was going on. But I just thought, back then when they filmed this in 92, 93, whenever when it played, that the writers were going, yeah, people understand that we're referencing the was it the McCarthyism, the anti-communism in Hollywood kind of thing from a generation earlier, which is like 3 generations now. But sometimes you can be a little too clever. In this case, it's not clever enough. This to me, honestly, this is a forgettable episode. I see really almost nothing redeeming about it in terms of if we had to distill a couple episodes out of the season 1 catalog, that this would be anywhere near the top. Because frankly, if we have 3 episodes, let's say, something's got to be the best, something's got to be the worst. This to me is not one of the better episodes. You know, what do you think?
I mean, I'm not going to say it's bad. And like I don't think anything is done poorly. It's just not as engaging, and that's just the sad truth.
Another thing too is, and I'll mention this as a little bit. I like the fact that Natalie's involved more. I can't seem to put a grasp on what they're trying to do with her this season, because early on the first few episodes, it seems like she's obviously his love interest and knows what he is. But then in some of the episodes after that, it seems like they're not. So it's like, were they planting seeds and they said, oh, we're going to kind of ignore that for now and then kind of redirect it in such another way. That's how I felt about Stanky's too, as far as him being a nice kind of almost co-equal rather than the laughing stock where at the end he's always talking about wanting to go get food and getting Nick to eat, ha ha ha, that kind of stuff. So it's just sort of there. It's really not their best representation of, although the women here are really stunning. They're quite beautiful. I've got the DVD version and the quality is decent. I think if you go on the Roku channel now in the United States, you can see it and it's actually a decent version. But again, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, some of the disclaimers. What's interesting about this show technically is that with one of being an earlier DVD release as opposed to the mastery that DVDs would start getting just a few years later, is I believe there's a Canadian version, an American version, and a European version. And from what I could gather from on my DVD collection is that you have a minute or two extra of, say, the Canadian version. So maybe the pronunciation dubbed there is differently. I've remarked on how horrible some of the audio is, and clearly it's just a really, really bad dubbing of the voices when they're going back doing their voiceover work. And then there's supposed to be, I guess, some nudity in some of these too, which I haven't seen. So I don't think these European ones, which might have a little bit more violence in it too, right? So late night television in the 90s on generic cable, where you would have a show like this, you might see some soft skin, as we would say. You won't see full on bush or necessarily butt, but more of an erotic theme to it. Obviously, with pay cable and all that, you'd have your different levels of stuff. But I just wondered, as a Canadian thing, what kind of restrictions they had to do, because obviously they had a core show, say 42 minutes, let's say. Then maybe they had 1 or 2 minutes of some scenes that you could clip that would be this or overdubbing, and then another one. So I feel there's a little bit of a disjointing to it. And unlike, say, Twin Peaks, which you could go back and look at from the very beginning digitally, you could definitely see what all those things are. And I think as popular as Forever Night is, and how passionate the fans are, I just wish some of these earlier shows that would eventually did make it to DVD would get a special treatment, because I think we would like the show a lot more. It was just a better looking show. And by that, it's not that the show looks bad, but I really want to see what it's like when they go into the Raven, or like when we get ready to talk about next week's episode, some of the shots in there, because there's definitely some things in season 1 here that look fantastic. And I go, man, if only that was HD rather than this semi-soft HD version that we get, even though it's not supposed to be a big budget show. Yeah, but overall, like I say, for me, a pretty forgettable episode. I think we're pretty much saying the same thing again here too. A lot of attractive women in it. Natalie's showing up at his place here at the end and they're talking about things. So no momentum in this. It's just a standalone is the way I would describe it. Any other final thoughts?
Agreed.
All right, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Season 1, episode 14, Forever Night. Spin Doctor, because it's always the person in the background, and we'll see if that theme continues next week when we can continue our review of season 1 of Forever Night. For Professor Pixel and everybody involved here in Xtreme Movie Show, I'm your host, Rob. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And thanks for commenting and sharing it out with the people that you know about it. Check us out next week as we do episode 15. Until then, good night now.
This was not a Dan Curtis production.